And I'm really very much delighted to be able to introduce our keynote speaker this morning, Dr. Stéphan Vincent-Lancrin. Yeah, actually, I know Stéphan for a few years, and I've always been very much amazed by his breadth of expertise. I started knowing him as an expert at OECD with digital education, AI in education, digital literacy, all those very digital things. And I know he's actually very technically competent as well, but I didn't know that he has a background in economics, right? So, and I think that must have sort of brought a lot of additional insight to the work that he has done. He is the deputy head of the Center for Educational Research and Innovation, or CIRI, and a senior education economist at OECD as well, where he leads work on digitization and AI in education. Hong Kong is not an OECD member country, but in fact, in the area of education, we are very much connected with that as well, because Hong Kong has been participating in PISA. And we actually did participate. Our faculty has been leading the PISA 2025 study in Hong Kong. And one component of the PISA 2025 is in fact learning in a digital world. So I'm very much looking forward to the release of the report later this year. Yes. So yeah, and I don't want to, because Stéphan has such a long sort of CV and a lot of honors, but I just want to say I was very impressed that he was, some of the things that we may not know, may not be aware of. He's a Marie Curie Fellow, a 2007 Fulbright New Century Scholar, a 2023 to 24 Residential Fellow at Stanford University Center for Advanced Study in Behavioral Sciences, and so on. So I think those are some of the things that would give us some insight as to how rich and broad Stéphan's background is. And so without further ado, may I invite Stéphan to give the keynote.
So thank you so much. It's really a great honor. And actually, I've known Nancy before. I met her in person as one of the big names on digital and innovation. So that it's really my pleasure now to know her in person and to be invited here to give this keynote and stay a little bit at Hong Kong U. Well, I can stay here. Oh, I have one too, so I will see if I want to shift and start to be a professor. I will do that. So what I'm going to talk to you about today is really, some of the work we've been doing on digital education. And so most of the things I'm going to tell come from this series of reports, the Digital Education Outlook, which we started just during COVID, actually. And where the idea initially was really to look at the frontier of technology in education. It was at the time when we were talking a lot about whether robots, computers were going to replace human beings, in the labor market. It was before COVID. So COVID created some kind of a new interest in the technology in education domain. And obviously when generative AI came out, then that became really the hot topic, and we started to be asked by our member countries to work on that. So the idea was really to use the emerging research to get a sense of the effects of generative AI on education from two perspectives, from teaching and learning, and also the more administrative back-end workflows as well, of education. So today I'm going to focus more on the teaching and learning part, and then just allude to the other possibilities. But so the big question was, what is the kind of attitude and take that we should have with this thing? So the first background thing that we need to have is that, well, it is contrary to many of the other technology that we have actually studied. It's one that is being adopted pretty quickly by people. And so you can see here, the levels don't matter so much, but you can see in the case of ChatGPT, you know, how fast actually the uptake is in many countries. And it's mainly driven by younger people, you know, so that's another very important aspect to know. When we have a good data on the uptake of generative AI, like this data from Switzerland, we can see that you have a kind of a very moderate use in primary education. About 50% of students in middle school actually use it. Almost 80% in high schools, you know, and a little bit less in the vocational ones, vocational high schools in the case of. But the point is that was in, 2 years back. And it is actually something that is already a real feature, you know, of the use. So in the case of Switzerland, it's used in class and out of class, you know, to the same extent. And all the information that we have for other countries, you know, the good information is about at these very high levels of actual use. So here, that's a study from European countries in terms of what do actually students do with it. And you can see that, you know, the main use is really using it like a search engine, you know, that's our Google, the new one. And that the part that we don't like so much, you know, is which is you just ask it to do everything for you at once, you know, it's about 1/3 of the students who actually do that. And the more interactive use, you know, comes a bit less, you know, requiring a bit more effort. So that in terms of, you know, the use, we have a lot of simple ones, and the more sophisticated are still relatively low. So that's a study from 2025. Higher education, well, it's even worse or better, depending on where you stand, but you have basically 90% of students in Germany and Austria using it. Similar studies. So this study is not representative, but based on a relatively large sample. And you have the same thing in international studies. We have a very big study in France as well, showing that it is a very, very high level of use of these tools. So the point of that is, well, it's quite difficult to just totally ignore the phenomenon, you know, because it does have an impact. And we have a little bit of studies on teachers, and teachers actually do use it too. So to, of course, a different extent, depending on the country. So that's the 2024 TALIS data. 2024, it's a long way, if you want, you know, compared to now, not always, but and when we have country surveys, we can show that, usually speaking, we have much higher levels of use. And just as a side note, when you interpret the data, you have to also think of the social desirability that people have to say that they do actually use it. You know, if you're a teacher and you're in a system where you're not supposed to use the tool, you know, then you may actually say that you don't. When you answer an opinion poll, then you may have a very different way of answering. So the idea of just feeling like, let's wait to do something about it, and, you know, we will see. Well, it's one possible strategy, but which doesn't necessarily match the current reality of adoption by younger people, students, and teachers outside of class, because a lot of this use is actually not facilitated by school systems or higher education systems, but it is actually done independently, usually out of class, you know. And so that's what we've seen in the higher education survey that we have, but it is also true in most of the countries. So the question is, what is the effect of, you know, these tools on student learning, and how can they actually impact it? So first thing is it good for learning, you know? And we've heard a lot about, well, some of the difficulties yesterday already, you know, these ideas of cognitive offloading. And yes, actually, that's a real risk. We have a few studies, and this is one of the strongest that we have, a randomized controlled trial in Turkey in high school, where basically math students give, well, the usual course to their high school students, and then they can practice in 3 different ways in the school, so that we don't know what's happening outside the school, but in the school. So either entirely by themselves with their teacher notes and their, textbooks as usual, or they can use a general purpose or a consumer GPT, ChatGPT, for example, or they can use one which is called, which is educational, which is called GPT Tutor, in what I'm going to show you before, and which is only very slightly configured in a Socratic way so as not to immediately give the answers to the students. And then when its practice is done, you go and you take your exam, obviously without any possible tool. So what happens is, during practice, what we observed is the practice results of those using the educational GenAI tool skyrocketed. They did much, much better than those who were studying by themselves. And those who used the consumer GPT also did better. However, once these tools were removed, that was a worse performance for those who had the consumer GPT and a similar one for those who had access to the educational one. And we can come back on why there is no reason. But here the point is actually not so much that you can do better, but it's more that there is a disconnect between the performance and the learning, so that you have actually an enhanced performance when you use these tools, and that's what this study and many others show. However, it doesn't imply that you have learned. And that's a very, very big challenge for education, because we assume that if a student can do something, then they have the knowledge and skills to actually do it, which is no longer necessarily the case when they have access to all these tools. And why is it the case? So we have a second set of studies, usually showing the same kind of results, but based on much smaller samples, so they're not as strong in terms of statistical power, but they use RCTs. But we have to think of them in a different way, because what they really do is to try to investigate what is the mechanism underlying, these different results. So here, that's an example. We have a few, and that's an example of one which looks at, so in China, it's students writing in English as a foreign language, and has to first write an essay in English and then to revise it in different way and seek help in a different ways, so either from human beings or from ChatGPT. And then, they measure how they do actually this process. And what they found is that if you actually use a human being as your tutor and your helper, so what you're going to do, usually speaking, is that, you will start to identify what is the question that you need help for. Then you will ask for this help. Then you will actually evaluate whether the help is good or not. You may have circle back, and then you will actually process and try to implement this thing. And you may actually, do several rounds of that. When you use ChatGPT, what you do is basically you go straight to asking the help, or a large share of people do that. And then the second thing that you may do is that you may directly process the help and then go back, ask help again, etc. So what you're actually doing is that some of the students continue to do the diagnosing question or the evaluation of the help, and try to continue to think about what they need to know and whether the quality of the help they've received is relevant, but much less. They skip these 2 different cognitive steps that we usually do to actually try to go faster, perhaps, and so that's what is basically, has been termed as metacognitive laziness, the fact that we actually become lazy on all the metacognitive processes that we usually do when we want to process some task or when we actually want to learn. And I could show you a lot of similar studies which, have more or less the same results. So the point is that, as we all know, there is a risk, and actually it has been proven to be the case. At the same time, a lot of people will tell you about that, but I was always feeling, how is it possible that you don't learn with these tools, because They provide the processor of information. You can do a lot of things with them. So is it actually possible to learn with those general purpose tools, which are, the one that we have in the consumer market? So you can, and so that's, I'm going to give you two examples of that. So here it's a writing task. It's been done by colleagues working on creativity. And so what they did was to ask a sample of people to write a very short story that is supposed to be creative and well written. And so you have three different conditions to do it. Either you do it entirely by yourself, or you can actually ask a generative AI to give you one idea, or you can ask a generative AI to give you 5 different ideas, and then you write your story, which is very short, 16 sentences, and it's then evaluated by human beings. So what happens is, well, those who had 5 ideas do better than those who received 1 idea, and better than those who did it by themselves in terms of creativity. Creativity being something that is novel or useful. So that's why you have these 2 different criteria. So it's more creative. And also, actually, it is also better written, so that you have, it's overall more enjoyable. The only area where it doesn't do as well as humans alone is being funny, but it's not statistically significant, unfortunately. That's, and the big difference with the studies I've shown you before is that this one, they do it by themselves, so you don't have the cognitive offloading that is happening. It's more perhaps that you're, breaking away from the writing anxiety, the white page, you get some, a good starting point, and that's actually something that is helpful. The only drawback is that even so the individual creativity and quality was stronger, the collective one was not as good. And so all the stories that were written using the generative AI ideas were more similar to one another compared to those who were written by the human beings. And actually the better stories were written by the humans who had access to ChatGPT and decided not to use it and just did it by themselves, possibly because, they were more confident and interestingly as well, it had a much better impact effect on those who were assessed to be less creative before they had to do the task. So that's a kind of first kind of GPS effect, if you want, that if you don't know the city, then, well, if you have a GPS, then, well, it enhances your performance tremendously. While if you know it very well, then it doesn't make much of a difference. Second example, and that's a different case, but one that I believe we should really keep in mind, and which is, even if we don't use a generative AI in class or as part of the process, given that people can use it in any event when they are at home, how do we redesign or rethink our ways of teaching, given the availability of ChatGPT and other generative AI tools outside of class? And so here, that's one of the things that colleagues in Slovenia have tried to tackle. And so basically, their objective was to redesign their course in such a way that the availability or the use of generative AI at home would not make any difference on the learning outcomes at the end. And actually, they've managed to do that. So it's a long university course with lectures. People had extended assignment, oral defense of their own programs, and they had paper-based midterm programs. So how did they manage to do that? First, by revising the assignments that they gave their students. So first, they checked that the assignment that they were giving were not too easily done by ChatGPT, and that you needed a certain level of expertise to prompt in such a way that it would work. And then they used the lab time, which was done in class, and so without ChatGPT, to extend the home assignment. So you had to come and then you had to actually continue to work on your program so that, so you had to understand a little bit when you were arriving. The other thing that they did was to have oral defenses. So you had to explain the program that you were coming with, during the lab time, and with a focus on a lot of conceptual aspects or, for example, having this code change question that I find interesting, what would be the minimal thing that would have a maximum effect that you could change that would have a maximum effect on your program or these kind of things. And then they did also something that the students hated, but they had their exams in a paper and pencil format, which is not usual in computer programming because then you miss all the autocorrect aspects of it that usually you have. But I think that is pretty, well, that's one example. And we need to think of what are the other examples, not just how we continue to improve the quality of the learning with the use of generative AI, but also how actually we make sure that even if we don't want it to be used in class, we make sure that we redesign our task in such a way that it doesn't have an effect on the learning. And then last question is, what about educational generative AI? Here I've shown you a lot of examples with general purpose tools. And I'm not just going to show you one example. That's also one of the strongest studies of the literature right now, which was done by colleagues at Stanford University. And basically what they've done is that they have designed, by fine-tuning a generative AI, a tool that incorporated some of the insights of good teachers on how to tutor students. And so it's a tutoring activity online, a digital platform, where basically, you have high school students in the US being tutored not by teachers, but by tutors. And some of them were actually receiving some support from this kind of a GPT. And then the idea, so that's also a randomized control trial. And the idea was then to measure the effect that it had on the students' achievement. And so what they found is, well, if you're considered to be a high quality tutor at the beginning, then when you use the tool, it doesn't make much difference. But if you're not, then actually it increased by 10% the achievement rate of the students, which is a lot, that's, and that was actually the same when you look at just the experience of the different tutors. And why? Because, well, you were actually nudged in the right direction and prompted to provide feedback that is effective when you do tutoring, so asking students to explain, and much less encouraging the students in a generic way or giving them the answer right away. So there is a value, in sometimes in using this tool, and there are a few other examples that I could give you which are more direct in terms of the actual learning. So what do we take away from this? That we still want students to perform highly, but actually we want this high performance to be correlated with a high level of learning. It is not always the case when you're not in education. In some cases, if I'm running a company of taxi drivers, I may not care that, my drivers actually have not only a high performance, but also a high level of learning. So that's something which is very specific to the education sector where, well, in fact, the performance is the learning, and so that's a very important aspect. So what it shows here is that you still need to have pedagogical intent, if you use these tools, if you want to have a positive impact, that we need to think of how to redesign our current pedagogies to make things happen, to actually pay more attention to the learning processes. You remember this metacognitive aspect of it. And so perhaps shift a bit to process-based assessments and pay more attention to the process. As we discussed yesterday, we need to identify what are these foundational knowledge or the foundational skills that students should have, and perhaps consider to have a dual mode of learning and assessing students for that with and without the generative AI, and also to work a bit more on developing educational tools which are designed not just to enhance the performance of people, but also to enhance actually their learning. So what does it look like? That's one of the aspects that we also focus on as part of the Digital Education Outlook, the latest version of it. So what does it bring to, there is a long tradition of intelligent tutoring systems, adaptive learning systems, all kinds of educational tools. And so now actually this has been integrated already, in some of these tools, and Canmigo is one example of that. But basically what on the positive side, what the thing that they actually provide is, this conversational dimension, because learning is also a social event. And so having a conversational thing is in a flexible way is something that was never quite done as well, with natural language processing before. Possibility to adapt to a lot of different subjects and to reshift in a lot of new ways, to personalize in a totally different way. There's challenges coming with it too, the hallucination is one of them. It's just a feature of these tools, and even if you can control to some extent, it remains a feature that is difficult to eliminate totally. And sometimes it's not a problem because you may want your students to fact check and you want to see how they respond, to these mistakes. But sometimes it's a problem, because when you're starting to learn something and you believe that you get a right answer and it's wrong, then actually just puts you on the wrong track and it's not necessarily very positive. And last but not least, one of the big difficulties, but that's true for a lot of technology in education, is also how to make it engaging to use. And I would say, more generally speaking, it's a big challenge for education system in general, because if we give students tasks that a generative AI can do for them, then we have to find the tasks that they want to do, so that's the kind of, and so the question of the engagement in the learning and the agency of the students becomes much, much more important. So one example, which is done actually by a colleague who's Memphis University and PolyU here in Hong Kong is, the Socratic Playground, which is one possible intelligent tutoring system. And one of the things that generative AI can help to do is to shift pedagogies. We like Socratic pedagogies, always never give the answer, always ask questions. Well, at some point I get tired if I only get questions all the time, sometimes I want to have the answer, and so that's what a human being can do, and that, an algorithm may not be as good at. So here you can see, interaction, they want to do this work on renewable energy. And you can see that, the student is kind of resisting a little bit, and then there is a shift, and then we take a new strategy, we provide a starting point, and then we restart from elsewhere. And so that's one of the kind of flexible aspect that generative AI can bring, and that was much more difficult to do in the past, when everything had to be kind of scripted. Generative AI can do a lot of things for teachers as well, generate lesson plans, contextualize them, provide detailed feedback for students. And for example, one thing that we advertise and that we like a lot, the use of rubrics, for example, for assessment to clarify what the learning goals are, the expectations are, is great, but it's so time consuming that, most of the teachers feel like, I can do it once, but I cannot do that too often. So, there is a lot of possible help that can come, and actually generative AI is pretty good for that. Compared here to a few studies comparing Gen AI and humans in preparing lessons, the quality is assessed to be the same quality, but you've gained a lot of time when you try to do that. Assignment for the grading of it, also great gain of time. So you have a big increase in productivity. Also, in terms of readability of the feedback, you get much more a detailed feedback, and which students find much more readable. However, there is a problem with more of the credibility. So perhaps that's and here we have actually, when students know that they get feedback from an AI, then they don't like it anymore, and which is problematic because, of course, when you give feedback, you want people to act on the feedback. Otherwise, there is no point of just giving it. So that's one aspect. The second one is more that you need to keep the social relationship in, the teaching and learning. And so if you're a teacher, it is actually your duty and your work, your job to actually assess and know how your students are actually doing. So for that reason, even if we have higher performance, we don't believe that it would be good to just leave it to, a generative AI to do that. And so that's really one of the cases where co-evolution or the hybrid model of both AI and teacher working together is the most promising way of doing things. So let's do a few policies as I've mentioned. So I'm just giving you a few examples and then hopefully we can have a discussion. So of course, countries are very, trying to do things about all these tools. In England, they have something which is interesting where they actually try to support the development of educational generative AI tools with they've issued project safety expectations for generative AI. So trying to create a market that will be safe, in terms of educational AI tool. And for that, they have also developed an AI education content to support the training of this model, the fine-tuning of it, with a lot of resources aligned with their curriculum, the research in the country, et cetera, et cetera. So in the case of Finland, they don't have much power to tell schools what to buy, not to buy. So what they try to do is to influence the developers of educational tools so that they will actually develop tools that are adapted to their local education system. France has taken a different approach. Well, they have actually developed guidelines, like many countries, on the use of AI in school. But what they're trying to do is to develop a so-called sovereign AI, which actually will be made available to teachers for, the lesson planning, also aligned with the curriculum, and also for students to some extent. They've extended their mandatory test on digital competencies to AI, which is called PICS and which is used in a lot of European countries. And then they actually are using generative AI also for work, for back-end workflows, and here with HR resources. Estonia is probably one of the currently most visible, and Greece, Estonia and Greece, they both have a partnership with OpenAI right now. And so what they're doing is they're kind of replicating the AI Tiger, the Tiger Leap that was actually something that they've done to introduce technology in education at the beginning. And they've kind of reproducing it now with AI, where they're building this agency which promotes public-private partnerships around AI. And so what they're doing is that they've made accessible, fine-tuned Gen AI tools to the high school students in 10th and 11th grade, as well as general purpose tools for all their teachers so that they could actually work and experiment and explore the use of generative AI. With actually a multi-level approach. One, work with the teachers and provide them with professional development, work with the students as well to see how they are using actually all these tools, but also work with companies to develop the technology in such a way that it is actually adapted to their local society and market. And they do an evaluation, so we'll know, what have been the impact in a few years. And as I've mentioned, Greece is actually taking the same approach. Last but not least, AI literacy is one of the elements of many of the countries are doing right now. Usually speaking, they try to actually develop the digital competencies of teachers. And you can see here that, a lot of it is happening in pre-service education by making mandatory to have some kind of teaching on that. The only problem, of course, is that most of the teachers are not pre-service, but in service. And so here you can see that you have much less levers to actually make the teachers develop these different skills. So what they do is actually to also make it competence for the students, also with the hope not only that the students are going to develop these skills, but that the teachers will have to develop them in order to develop their students' skills. And you can see here, there are different ways of doing that. Most of the time, it's a transversal competency, which means that everyone is in charge of it, which is a strength and a weakness, when everyone is in charge of something. And in a few cases, with an approach which is much more specific. And if you're interested in what's going on in Europe in particular, there was just a recent report by European SchoolNet showing what they were actually doing. We at the OECD also do some work on that. We have an AI literacy framework, which was co-developed with the European Commission, which was has been in the stage of draft consultation for almost 1 year now, and which will be published on the 18th of June, the final version of it, and which is actually aligned with the next PISA 2029 framework on AI and media literacy. That will be one of the innovative domain in 2029, and which will look at all the different ways of dealing with AI. So understanding a little bit, having the basics about what it does, being able to actually use it to create something, and understanding the limitations of it. The only aspect that is not going to be measured is actually the technical aspect of developing and designing these AI tools. So let me conclude. What we've shown basically that general purpose Gen AI may not lead to learning, despite enhanced student performance. And that's really one of the important caveat of all that. But with good pedagogical intent and supervision, it can actually lead to learning. And we also have evidence of that. And it is also possible that despite its availability, we have learning, but in some cases, we have to redesign the pedagogy that we use. It is possible, and we have a few examples, so I haven't shown all of them here, of educational tools that support the learning and support the teachers in such a way that it preserves the agency and autonomy, and so that can have also a positive effect. Even so, we have much less evidence on the impact on students right now, so that's really one of the things that has to come in the future in terms of research. And the last caveat is that in some cases, even if the use of generative AI surpasses what a human can do, we may want to carefully consider whether we want to use it nonetheless. So that means we need to rethink of what's fundamental knowledge in all the different domains, perhaps have dual modes of teaching and learning, review our assessment formats, and perhaps also in higher education, think of how we prepare students to both use and develop actually specialized tools for the research that they are doing. One of the important messages I would like you to take over is, when we say about AI, well, AI is a lot of different things, and so we have to keep in mind which AI we're talking about exactly, and so we have generative and non-generative, and we also have consumer, general purpose, and educational. And all these things are different. They have different virtues, different drawbacks as well. And we really need to keep that in mind when we have policy discussions or when even we talk about the use of all these different tools. So we've been developing some guidelines on the use of generative AI, which have 4 different domains: teaching, learning, and assessment, the investment in generative AI, educational R&D, the effectiveness of the infrastructure, as well as the policy environment that is necessary. And with, as we always say, human agency or human in the loop at the center of it. They're going to be published formally in a couple of weeks as a last chapter of the Digital Education Outlook, which wasn't available before because, we were a diplomatic organization, and sometimes negotiating these kind of documents takes longer than what we hope. And basically, that's the key messages. I'm not going to read them. I will let you read it, and so that we can go quicker to possible question and answers. So that's the part on teaching, learning, and assessment. investment in R&D. You know, the idea is that we need to go towards more educational generative AI tools, and that we need to have much more co-creation and co-design with different stakeholders. The policy aspect, I would say, is kind of more traditional, even so there are a few specificities of generative AI compared to AI in education in general. And last but not least, you know, the access, and where it is also, I would say, rather traditional kinds of messages. Even so, in the case of generative AI, the good news is that we have, for example, the small language models that can allow to overcome some of the connectivity and infrastructure challenges in an easier way than was possible in the past. So we have to continue to work internationally about that, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Stéphan, for the fabulous talk, taking us all the way from research results to the terrain in terms of different countries, initiatives, and also to now where the policy is going. So I'm sure colleagues here would have any comments or questions.
Hi, Stephen. This is Nicole. I was based in UNESCO, Cambodia. And there was this concern that I had while discussing with the Ministry of Education, even though they don't say it, of course, officially, but they, for that country, and I think that that issue is shared by many other developing countries, is that there's a shortages of teachers. And then also on top of that, the quality of teaching due to the low qualification of teachers and training. And I think they actually did consider using AI tutor to replace or to fill that gap. So what's your insight? What do you think of that? Because I don't have, I also myself in the working in this field don't really have a good answer to that.
I think it's actually a big opportunity for developing countries. I don't think that, you know, the teachers should be replaced altogether. You know, that would be very dangerous to do that, because you still need the social relation in the learning, but you can actually find ways to increase the quality of the teaching, you know, when there is, as you've mentioned, and hire people who you would never consider perhaps to hire before in the teaching workforce, you know, and you can provide students with a lot of new support, you know. So it requires an infrastructure in some cases that is not necessarily available everywhere. But as I've mentioned, with some progress of the, you know, there is, and for those who are interested in the digital education outlook, we have a discussion with Seiji Izotani, who is one of a researcher who's done a lot of work on AI unplugged, meaning how do we actually use AI in contexts where there is no connectivity, very few devices, and no digital competence. And actually, it's amazing that you can do things nonetheless, you know. And so I believe it's an opportunity. There's some risk coming with it as well, but that's something probably that they should consider.
For a wonderful presentation. So as a resident from Macau, we actually achieved surprisingly high PISA result in 2021, for example, and I certainly question the sustainability and credibility of the result. But more importantly, my question is, as AI responses caters to the user's preferences, we can gradually become fixated on our views, arguments, and way of thinking. Think of recommender systems. So in the context of AI-human interaction and collaboration, question 1, what should be the roles of teachers, students, and AI be in helping us to evaluate our arguments? And question 2, how can we develop the cognition to challenge AI, for example, LLMs, and embrace AI-assisted educational technology to do vice versa?
Well, your second question is, we need to continue to learn the foundational knowledge in the domain so that we can actually know what is the quality of the output of these LLMs. So that's one aspect. The second one, we also have to learn to use these tools so that we enhance our performance, because that's also one of the requirements that we will have for one of the dimensions of education, which is basically preparing us for the economy, the society in which we live, and the labor market. So that's so yeah, I think that's really. What was your first question? So on the different perspective, that's an interesting one, because sometimes AI can actually help us to find what are those different perspectives, or help teachers to find what are all these different perspectives. When we think about the kind of 21st century competencies, like creativity, critical thinking, when we want to have different perspectives so that we can make a judgment, one of the big impediments to that agenda is that we're so used to thinking of problems in what is right and what is wrong, in an educational setting, that some cases, the brainstorming aspect of it can help to open, our minds. The second thing I would say is that we need to try to make education more authentic again, and so that it's not just something that we have to go through so that we can succeed at an exam that will actually then lead us to do some other things. And so one of the roles of the teachers in that respect is to find ways to engage the students and to make them relate to the learning in a much more authentic way than what we used to do in the past.
Right. We probably have time for one more question. Anyone?
Sorry. Thank you so much. I just take advantage of being a facilitator here. And thank you so much for the enlightening presentation. And I'm really interested in the divorce of performance and the learning gains. So my question is, I totally agree with you that we need to carefully design what students can get from the from the chatbot. Recently, the world's largest free online learning platform, they have this chatbot. And they carefully design the chatbot and to like the chatbot to ask questions to guide students to find the right answer. However, they found that students don't want to use it. Students don't want to be asked questions. They don't want to be guided, and they want to get the answer like quick and easy. So I was super interested in, as an expert in AI literacy and education, do you have any advice for them?
That's actually one of the common pitfalls of technology tools, that even when they are effective and have been proven to be effective, one of the big difficulties is to get students to use them enough so that this effectiveness can actually be reached. So here again, I think that, so one of the challenge for them, I would try to make them think not just on how to scaffold, but how to make this interesting for the students. I don't have the answer on how to do that, but I think that the engagement, motivational question becomes much more important than it used to be. Second thing I would like to say is, and that's what we say in our insights or guidelines on the use of generative AI, it is a shared responsibility across all stakeholders, and so it's not just the technology company. The students also have to understand that if they want to learn something, they have to work, and that, they have to engage in some cognitive effort. They have to read from time to time something. And so it is also their responsibility, as well as, the company's responsibility, government, teachers, etc. But I would also perhaps, make it clear to students that if they don't want to learn, that's perhaps their decision. But if they want to learn something, then they have to work. That's.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I said last question, but I want to sort of ask one question myself. So you have sort of shared with us some initiatives from different European countries on AI education and so on. Now, I was actually quite surprised to learn those specifics. because in the public media, we read a lot about the pushback from different particular Western countries. So I would like you to comment on whether there is a sort of divide between the policy and the general public or the education community.
Yes, so it depends on the countries. So you don't have these kind of initiatives in all the different countries, and there are a few countries, a lot of countries are more taking a stance of wait and see. And so, that being said, most of them have issued guidelines, which doesn't say you shouldn't use it, but here are the different ways of doing it. But you're absolutely right that there is, interestingly, the pushback is not so much on AI or the generative AI. There is much more of pushback on social media, but also on mobile phones. So one of the things that you see in many countries, including the US and others, is a ban on mobile phones in school. That's which is also the case in Estonia. So Estonia has banned mobile phones, but launched a big initiative on the use of AI in education. Of course, the only problem you do when you do that is that it means that you have to provide the devices. If you don't want people to come with their own device and use it, that you have to provide the devices. And so that's one of the big challenges for many countries, because as you know, now the budgets are more related to geopolitical, preparing for all the geopolitical issues that we see in the world. And so education is not in a great budgetary situation in many of countries in the OECD right now.
Thank you so very much. So I know we don't have time. There's so much that we need to be debating or discussing, and particularly, I really appreciate how Stéphan's keynote actually builds on our previous two keynotes. And so what is foundational is an issue, and also, the technology itself is changing as we speak. And so how do we handle that? And so how should we prepare teachers and students for this kind of new fluidity? But this certainly has helped us to make sense of where we are and thinking about the future. So let's all give Dr. Vincent-Lancrin a big round of applause.